Blade successfully made the transition from Marvel's comics to the silver screen. So why not to video games? A vampire hunter with all the strengths of a vampire, but none of the weaknesses. Seems like a good premise for an action-packed game. So does it deliver on its potential, or is it simply another failed adaptation? Let's find out. Today, we take a look back at Blade. Blade was developed by Hammerhead and published by Activision in November of 2000, a little over 2 years after the film's release, and about a month after fellow Marvel character Spider-Man's PlayStation debut. Blade is a third-person action game that throws you into the vampire-infested world of Gothic City, blasting your way through enemies amid a dark atmosphere and drab environments, owing to the subject matter and to the witching hours of the undead. You take on the role of Blade, the Daywalker, a half-human, half-vampire hybrid who has dedicated his life to rid the world of the vampire plague, and avenge the death of his late mother, who died by their hands, or fangs as it were. Aided by his mentor Abraham Whistler, who provides his expertise in the ways of the vampire, and by creating weapons to eradicate the vampire threat, with Whistler even becoming a playable character for a brief period during the game. While you may think of Blade as a master of martial arts, and might expect typical hack-and-slash gameplay, the game is largely centered around ranged, tactical weapons-based combat, using a lock-on auto-aim system and featuring a number of different weapons, ranging from your standard pistol and shotgun to the iconic machine pistol from the film, with the powerful multi-launcher rounding out your ranged arsenal. Switching between weapons actually pauses the game, and this coupled with the variety of ammo at your disposal leads to its more tactical feel, with each weapon offering multiple bullet types which are best suited for specific enemies. Standard ammo being most effective versus humans, carbon against monsters, and silver for vampires. But of course, Blade is best known for his sword, and the game does include it as well as other close-range melee attacks, being most effective against vampires and aided by the fact that these enemies do not have ranged attacks. So the gameplay does attempt to steer you into dealing with the undead in this way, even if the sword combat isn't as fine-tuned or as satisfying as you may have hoped for. Graphically, the game looks pretty good and about what you would expect from a title released at a time when the PS2 was already on store shelves, largely relying on lighting effects to contrast the dark environments, with some noticeable frame rate dips that ultimately don't affect the gameplay. Coupled with an outstanding techno-based soundtrack, it sets a convincing stage for the world of Blade. So let's jump into the game and see what it's like to play. You're thrown right into the action, starting off equipped with a pistol and displaying on-screen hints to detail the combat system. R2 locks onto an enemy and displays their health and a colored circle that identifies their type in the upper right portion of the screen. Green indicating a human, red a vampire, and yellow a zombie or monster. What the game fails to mention, and what I didn't realize until about an hour into the game, after finally reading the manual, always read the manual, is that by timing your shots just as the target gauge fills up, you can perform a critical attack. This allows you to do much more damage, and even kill some enemies in a single hit. This one feature completely saves the combat system, and turns it from a routine task to one of more precision, and it's vital for successfully making it through the game. But it's also immediately apparent that Blade has a critical problem: the camera. The fixed camera angle works fine for open environments with enemies in plain sight, but we rarely encounter these ideal conditions. Lots of enemies are placed just around corners before you're able to lock on, and you take a lot of cheap damage in this way. You can attempt to counteract this by strafing to peek around corners, but it certainly doesn't add to the game's already slow pace. The camera is mostly fixed behind Blade, but there are tighter sections where it shifts into a fixed position elsewhere, a la Resident Evil, giving it a somewhat cinematic feel. And while the abrupt camera shift can be jarring at first, anyone who grew up playing games from this era should quickly adapt. And speaking of Resident Evil, Blade also uses tank controls. So while general movement can be a chore, and I got stuck against the environment more than I care to admit, the negatives are largely negated by the auto-aim system. While locked onto your target, you can still move and strafe with no worries of having your next shot lined up. The game also offers a jump button to navigate the environment, which is largely relegated to simple platforms, mostly used to acquire pickups or other optional items, and we are thankfully not treated to any tediously difficult platforming sections. While Blade's likeness is vaguely that of Wesley Snipes from the film, he does not provide any voice work. And while disappointing, the voice acting that is present is outstanding, and easily makes up for it.
It's a war, a civil war in the House of Erebus.
The game's story takes place before the events of the film, and puts you into a vampire civil war. Investigating a mysterious shipment, you soon uncover a plot by the Palatine clan to unleash an ancient and powerful evil, to help support their reign of terror and displace the Dragonetti in the Vampire Council. You soon discover that inside the shipment is a creature known as the Night Beast, a creature that has the power to usher in a world of eternal night, and bring vampires out of the shadows to rule over mankind. It's now up to Blade to track down this beast and save the world. Blade takes place in a continuous environment with no levels per se, but gated by needing to flip switches or acquire keys to access the next area, leading to some exploration, and the game even offering branching paths at certain points, with in-game cutscenes moving along the plot as you advance. Aside from save points, which are placed throughout, the game features resupply points where you use the money acquired from fallen enemies to purchase ammo and healing items. Unfortunately, you can't purchase items specifically, and it just seemingly gives you ammo at random. This definitely could have been implemented better. Much like switching between weapons or ammo types, you can select different healing items by holding L1 and cycling through them with left and right. This also pauses the action, and I have to give the game credit for its item and weapon management. While it leads to slower paced action, it's very easy to switch between your items and lets you always put yourself into the right loadout, especially during a time where most games make it overly tedious. Just hold a button and cycle through. Nice. The game also features a stamina mechanic that I can only assume is in place for the sword and melee combat, but it's clearly an afterthought and not something that I ever worried about, with sword combat being outshined very early on and consisting of simply locking onto a target and button mashing. It sorely lacks any block or parry features, and it's a shame that it wasn't implemented better. As you explore the environments, you will come across somewhat hidden items like glyphs, which provide more backstory and are accessed via the main menu's library tab, and act as a sort of bonus item collectible. You can also find weapon parts, which Whistler can use to craft a powerful laser weapon. Find them all, and it actually changes the final level, and how you deal with the Night Beast himself. The game also features a few boss characters, and while most are typical fights of keeping your distance and blasting away, you do encounter a boss that is immune to your weapons, and needs to be taken down by damage from other enemies. Not the greatest experience due to the game's controls, but a welcome change of pace from the typical gameplay. You eventually track down the location of the deadly Night Beast, and the final battle ensues. I easily found all the items for the laser weapon, and I'd say they aren't too hidden or much trouble to acquire. Apparently if you don't find them all, the final battle involves flipping switches to kill the boss with sunlight, which actually sounds pretty cool. The Night Beast fires projectile attacks, so run around and fire the laser when possible, and try to keep a safe distance from his melee attacks, using medkits when necessary. Not an overly difficult fight. Deliver the killing blow, and you are then treated to the in-game cutscene. Here we see a vampire feasting and the emergence of Blade.
Hey Walker, my name is Blade.
The credits roll, and the game is finished. Overall, Blade suffers from a lot of the problems that plagued 3D action games of its time. While the controls are passable, the main culprit here is a horrible fixed camera system that is made worse by the game putting most enemies right around corners. And while it's disappointing that a game based around Blade doesn't implement swordplay well, the range combat is actually pretty good, and the ease of switching between your weapons and loadout is done to perfection. But in total, I found it to be a pretty middle-of-the-road offering, with its strengths slightly outweighing its negatives. In its time, Blade was released to mostly mixed reviews. EGM gave the game scores ranging from 3 to 7. Next Gen gave the game 2 stars. And the official PlayStation magazine gave the game 2.5 out of 5, stating, "Problems aside, Blade certainly achieves a respectable level of decency. If you're aching to take a walk on the dark side, it might just satiate you for a while." So that's a look back at Blade. Only ever released on the PlayStation, it might be worth a spin for fans of the franchise. Thanks for watching everyone, and I'll see you next time.
My name is Blade.